A chimpanzee always seemed straightforward to me. Expressive face, playful personality, our closest relative. I thought I understood what they were. But once I actually started digging into how a chimpanzee works, not what documentaries show, but what the research actually says, everything changed. I didn't expect to find an animal this cognitively sophisticated, this politically complex, and this deliberately violent. Like, there are chimpanzees that conduct coordinated military raids on neighboring groups, executing individuals one by one over the course of years, and some plan their attacks days in advance. The deeper I went, the more unsettled I became at how much I never knew. Chimpanzees share 98.7% of our DNA. That number gets repeated so often it stops meaning anything. But here's what it actually means. The gap between us and a chimpanzee is smaller than the gap between a chimpanzee and a gorilla. We are not observing a distant relative through glass. We are looking at something that thinks, plans, holds grudges, wages war, and manufactures weapons, and doing it with a brain that diverged from ours only 4 to 7 million years ago. And the closer you look, the harder it becomes to explain where the animal ends, and something else begins. Start with the body, because the body is the first place the assumptions fall apart. Most people, if they think about chimpanzee strength at all, imagine something vaguely impressive but manageable. An animal the size of a small human, probably stronger than average, but nothing that couldn't be handled by a fit adult. Here's what the research actually found. For nearly 100 years, anecdotal accounts described chimpanzees performing feats of strength that seemed physically impossible, pulling weights that would challenge professional strongmen, tearing apart materials that required industrial equipment to replicate. Scientists assumed these stories were exaggerated. In 2017, a research team, including scientists from the University of Arizona, decided to actually measure what was happening inside chimpanzee muscle tissue. What they found surprised them. The difference between chimpanzee and human muscle isn't in the quality of the fibers. Individual muscle cells from chimps and humans are remarkably similar. The difference is in the ratio. Human muscle is composed of roughly 70% slow-twitch fibers, the type built for endurance, for sustained effort over long distances. Chimpanzee muscle is approximately 67% fast-twitch fibers. The explosive kind, the kind that generates maximum force in minimum time. The result, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, showed that chimpanzee muscle produces about 1.35 times the dynamic force and power output of human muscle of the same size. That sounds modest. It isn't, because it means that when a chimpanzee moves, every movement engages muscle systems optimized simultaneously for speed and power in a way human anatomy simply does not. We traded that capacity away, evolutionarily, in exchange for the ability to walk long distances and run for extended periods. We became endurance animals. The chimpanzee stayed explosive. The practical implication of this is something that primatologists who work with chimpanzees describe consistently and with a specific kind of emphasis. You cannot overpower a chimpanzee. Not a healthy adult, not with training, not with size. The architecture isn't there in the human body to produce the force required. And the chimpanzee's grip, developed over millions of years of supporting full body weight in forest canopy, closes with a mechanical advantage that no human hand can match. But here's what I didn't expect when I started looking into this. The strength is almost beside the point. Because the thing that actually separates chimpanzees from almost every other animal isn't what their body can do, it's what their mind does with it. Chimpanzees use tools. That sentence has become so familiar it barely registers anymore. But when Jane Goodall first reported it in the 1960s, watching chimpanzees in Gombe, Tanzania select specific plant stems, strip the leaves, and insert them into termite mounds to extract insects, the scientific community's response was not congratulation. It was disbelief. At the time, tool use was considered a defining characteristic of humanity, the working definition of what separated us from other animals. Goodall's mentor, paleoanthropologist Louis Leakey, responded to her report with a statement that became famous. Now we must redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as humans. They redefined tool. But here's what surprised me when I went deeper into what chimpanzee tool use actually involves. It's not instinctive. It's not a hardwired behavior that every chimpanzee performs identically. It's cultural. Different populations of chimpanzees use different tools in different ways for different purposes, and they teach these techniques to their young. A community in West Africa uses stone hammer and anvil sets to crack oil palm nuts, carrying preferred stones to specific locations and passing that knowledge across generations. A community in a different region, with access to the same nuts, does not use this technique. Not because they can't, because no one taught them. Researchers studying multiple chimpanzee populations have now documented dozens of distinct cultural behaviors that vary by group, transmitted through observation and instruction, and maintained across generations. These are not genetic differences. They are learned traditions, the kind of thing that, in humans, we call culture. And the tool use has been getting more alarming the further researchers look. In 2007, a research team in Senegal documented something that had never been recorded before in a non-human primate. Chimpanzees, specifically female chimpanzees and juveniles, were observed breaking branches, stripping them of bark and side shoots, sharpening the ends with their teeth, and using the resulting implements to stab into hollow tree cavities where smaller primates were sleeping. They were making spears and using them to hunt. Here's what that actually means when you think about it carefully. A spear is not a rock picked up from the ground. A spear requires identifying the right material, modifying it through a series of deliberate steps, breaking, stripping, sharpening, holding in mind a future use that doesn't exist yet in physical form, and then deploying the result in a hunting context. The sequence requires planning. It requires a mental model of what the tool needs to be before the tool exists. This is not behavior that happens by accident. It is behavior that requires something working inside that brain that most of us have no good framework for thinking about in an animal that is not human. But the thing that changed how I thought about chimpanzees entirely wasn't the tools. It was what happened in Gombe between 1974 and 1977. Jane Goodall had been studying a single chimpanzee community for over a decade when, in the early 1970s, it split into two groups. The northern group, which Goodall called the Kasakela community, and a smaller southern group she called the Kahama community. These had been members of the same social group. They had groomed each other. Some had grown up together. Over the next 4 years, the Kasakela males systematically hunted down and killed every member of the Kahama community. Not in open confrontation, in raids. Small groups of males would move silently to the edge of their territory, cross the boundary, locate an isolated individual from the southern group, and attack as a coordinated unit, holding the victim down while others delivered the blows, before withdrawing back to their own range. The attacks were methodical. The attackers showed, by behavioral measures, awareness of risk. They turned back when they detected a large group. They pressed forward when numbers favored them. They killed males, females, and infants, one by one, over years. When Goodall published her findings, the scientific community's first instinct was to question her methodology. The behavior was too disturbing to accept easily. Surely it was a response to human presence, to some artificial disruption of natural behavior. Subsequent research dismantled that explanation entirely. Long-term studies across multiple chimpanzee populations with no provisioning, no habituating contact, documented the same pattern. Researchers now call it coalitionary killing. Border patrols are a regular feature of chimpanzee life. Males conduct reconnaissance at territorial boundaries, moving in silence, freezing to listen, assessing the situation before committing to action. A 2014 study published in the journal Nature, analyzing data from 18 chimpanzee communities across decades of observation, found that the rate of lethal intergroup violence in chimpanzee populations was higher than in virtually any other mammal studied. and that this violence was not triggered by human disturbance. It emerged from the same competitive pressures that shaped the species over millions of years. Chimpanzees go to war. They did not learn this from us, and the more you sit with that fact, the more uncomfortable the implications become. Here's something that surprised me about chimpanzee society that I hadn't expected to find. It's political. Not metaphorically political, structurally, operationally political in ways that a primatologist named Frans de Waal spent decades documenting, and that he described in a book titled Chimpanzee Politics, published in 1982, that has been cited in political science literature alongside Machiavelli. Chimpanzee communities are organized around a dominance hierarchy with an alpha male at the top, but the alpha does not hold that position through strength alone. Strength matters. But what matters more is coalition management. An aspiring male will spend months, sometimes years, building alliances. He grooms rivals strategically, creating social obligations. He supports lower-ranking males in confrontations, accumulating loyalty. He reads the political landscape with a precision that de Waal described, after decades of observation, as genuinely strategic, choosing when to display, when to submit, when to push, and when to wait. What de Waal found that was most striking wasn't the ambition. It was the patience. A male chimpanzee planning a leadership challenge doesn't rush. He builds. He waits for the right configuration of allies. He times his move to the moment when the existing alpha is most vulnerable. When he's injured, when his own alliances have weakened, when the political ground has shifted in ways that took months to arrange. De Waal described watching a male named Louis at the Arnhem Zoo spend over a year systematically building coalitions, disrupting the existing alpha's alliances, and eventually taking power in a transition that was, by any behavioral measure, calculated. When Chimpanzee Politics was published, several political scientists noted that the strategies de Waal described were structurally identical to those described in Machiavelli's The Prince, written for human rulers in the 16th century. Nobody had told the chimpanzees, males who lose power do not retire. They are harassed, excluded, sometimes killed by the new regime. The stakes are real. Power in chimpanzee society is a survival resource. And within this political structure, chimpanzees hold grudges. Research has confirmed they remember individual interactions across years. A chimpanzee that was wronged by another adjusts its behavior toward that individual based on what happened, sometimes immediately, sometimes much later. Studies have documented chimpanzees waiting, behaving normally in the interim, and then retaliating against a specific individual at a chosen moment. This is not reactive aggression. It is something closer to premeditation. An animal that can wait, remember, calculate, and then act, with the physical capacity to do serious harm when it does, is something that requires a different category of attention than dangerous animal. Here's what I find genuinely strange about all of this. The more research accumulates on chimpanzee cognition, the more it reveals capabilities that we didn't expect to find outside of humans. And the more uncomfortable the question becomes, what exactly are we looking at? Chimpanzees communicate, not with language, but with a gestural system that researchers have been mapping for years. And that has turned out to be far more complex than anyone anticipated. A 2023 study identified 80 distinct gestures used by wild chimpanzees that carried consistent, intentional meaning. The same gesture meant the same thing across populations that had never been in contact. They plan for the future. In one well-documented study, a chimpanzee at a Swedish zoo named Santino was observed calmly collecting stones from his enclosure's moat every morning before the zoo opened, caching them in specific locations, and then throwing them at visitors later in the day. He was manufacturing ammunition in advance for an event that hadn't happened yet. Researchers initially thought it was coincidence. Then they watched him do it over and over, for years, only during the months the zoo was open to the public. Planning for a future state, one that required modeling not just his own behavior, but the behavior of the humans who would arrive hours later. They deceive. Chimpanzees have been documented withholding distress calls when a dominant male is nearby. not because they aren't distressed, but because making the call would attract an animal they'd rather avoid. That is not a reflex. That is a calculation about what information to communicate and what to withhold based on who is listening. And perhaps most unsettling, they appear to be aware of death in a way that no simple instinctive explanation covers. Documented cases from multiple research sites describe chimpanzees remaining with dead group members, sometimes for days, grooming the body, returning to the site afterward, young chimpanzees carrying deceased siblings. These behaviors don't have a straightforward adaptive explanation. They look, from the outside, like grief, which is not a word that should be easy to apply to an animal. But the harder you look at a chimpanzee, the harder it becomes to find the line where that word stops applying. There is one more thing I didn't expect to find when I started researching this. As forests shrink and chimpanzee ranges increasingly overlap with human settlements, in Uganda, in Cameroon, in Guinea, across Central and West Africa, something has been documented in the contact zones that researchers describe carefully, with a specificity that is worth paying attention to. Chimpanzees in these areas have been observed entering human settlements deliberately, moving through villages, assessing what's there. In Uganda's Kibale region, chimpanzees have entered homes and taken infants. The attacks are not random or panicked. The animals move with the same deliberate assessment that characterizes their behavior in territorial raids. They locate a target, they act, they withdraw. Local communities in these areas do not describe chimpanzees with the warmth that tends to characterize outside perceptions of them. They describe them the way people describe something dangerous that has demonstrated what it will do when given the opportunity. And the critical context is this: the chimpanzees entering these spaces are not doing so because they are malfunctioning or aberrant. They are doing so because their habitat has shrunk by more than 80% in the last century. What remains is fragmented, contested, increasingly surrounded by human activity. The animal that conducts organized warfare over territory is now finding its territory systematically reduced. The animal that plans, remembers, calculates, and holds grudges is living in closer proximity to humans than at any point in the history of either species, and it is arriving at that proximity with the full suite of cognitive and physical capabilities that evolution spent millions of years building. We share 98.7% of our DNA with this animal. The thing that kept striking me, the more I read, was not how different chimpanzees are from us. It was how thin the line is. The warfare, the politics, the tool use, the deception, the grief. These are not imitations of human behavior. They are the original version of behaviors that we share a common ancestor for. We didn't invent these things, and the chimpanzee didn't copy them. We both inherited them from something that came before both of us. The 1.3% that separates our genomes is where the difference lives. Language in its full form, abstract symbolic thought, the ability to build and transmit knowledge across centuries in writing, cities, mathematics, spacecraft. But the 98.7%, the part that calculates advantage, forms coalitions, plans attacks, remembers slights, and goes to war over territory, that part is not uniquely human. It is sitting in a shrinking forest right now in populations of 170,000 to 300,000 animals, navigating a world that is getting smaller every year. Nothing about a chimpanzee is simple, and the closer you look, the more clearly you can see that what makes them extraordinary is not how alien they are. It is how familiar. If you want to understand another animal that shares far more with us than most people realize, but that has taken a completely different evolutionary path to the same end, the next video on this channel is about spotted hyenas. The social complexity, the intelligence, the political structure, a different animal, the same discomfort.